Close your eyes and imagine a world before borders, before nations as we know them, before the maps were drawn and redrawn by empires that rose and fell like tides. There was a time when the earth itself seemed to shift beneath the hooves of horses, when a single name whispered across continents could make kings tremble and cities surrender without a single arrow drawn. That name was Genghis Khan, but this is not just a story of conquest. This is a story of transformation, of how one man born into the frozen silence of the Mongolian steppe would stitch together the largest land empire the world has ever known, and in doing so, change the very fabric of human history. Tonight, as the world outside grows quiet, let us journey back to a time when the impossible became inevitable, when the map of the world was still being written, and when the thunder of hooves carried not just war, but the seeds of a new era. Rest now and let the story unfold. If these words carry you closer to sleep, and if the past feels like a gentle companion in the quiet hours, let this channel stay by your side too. A small tap, a quiet subscription, is all it takes to keep these stories coming, night after night, as you drift into dreams. No rush, no pressure, just an invitation, soft as a whisper, to join this circle of listeners who find peace in the past. Chapter 1. Born into the cold wind. There are places on this earth where the wind does not merely blow, it howls. It cuts, it shapes everything it touches. The Mongolian steppe is one of those places. Endless grasslands stretch toward horizons that seem to curve away from the sky itself. And in winter, the cold descends like a living thing, testing every creature, every blade of grass, every human soul brave or foolish enough to call it home. It was into this world in the year 1162 that a boy was born. His name was Temujin, and the story goes that he came into the world clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist, dark and solid as a stone. The shamans who attended his birth whispered among themselves. It was a sign, they said, a warrior's mark. This child would spill blood. This child would be great. But the steppe does not care for prophecies. It cares only for survival. Temujin's father was Yasuge, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin tribe, a man of some respect but no great power. He ruled over a small collection of families, herders mostly, people who moved with the seasons, following the grass and the water, living in felt tents that could be packed and moved in a single morning. Life on the steppe was hard, unforgiving, and simple. You tended your animals. You defended your territory. You made alliances when you could, and you fought when you had to. Yasuge was capable, but he lived in a world where strength was fragile, where a single mistake could erase a family line, where enemies were as common as the stars above. And he had enemies. Everyone did. When Temujin was still a boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, his father took him on a journey to find him a bride. It was tradition. Marriages were arranged early, cementing alliances between tribes, ensuring that bloodlines would strengthen rather than fracture. They traveled to another clan, and there Yasuge found a girl named Bert, strong and steady-eyed, from a family of good standing. The match was made. Temujin would one day marry her. But for now, the boy would stay with her family, learning their ways, building bonds, while Yasuge returned home alone. It should have been a simple arrangement, a quiet piece of diplomacy woven into the fabric of steppe life. But on his way back, Yasuge stopped to share a meal with a group of Tatars, an old rival tribe. They recognized him, and they poisoned him. The news reached Temujin's family like a blade in the dark. Yasuge was dead. and with his death, everything unraveled. The tribe that had followed him, that had respected him, turned away. They abandoned his widow and her children, leaving them to fend for themselves in a world that did not tolerate weakness. Temujin's mother, Holan, was cast out with her children, 4 boys and 1 daughter left, to survive in the wilderness with nothing but determination and grief. The steppe, which had been their home, became their prison. They ate roots and wild onions. They caught fish with bent needles. They scraped by in a way that most people cannot imagine, clinging to life with raw, desperate hands. And through it all, young Temujin watched. He learned. He grew harder. There was a moment, a small and terrible moment, that would define him. One of his half-brothers, Begder, older and stronger, began to assert dominance over the family. He took food that was not his. He challenged Temujin's authority. And in the logic of the steppe, in the brutal arithmetic of survival, Temujin made a choice. He and his full brother, Kassar, hunted Begder down and killed him, just like that. A boy murdering his own brother. Their mother was horrified, heartbroken, raging at what her sons had become. But Temujin did not apologize. He did not weep. He had learned the first and harshest lesson of his life. Mercy was a luxury. Power was the only currency that mattered. If you did not take what was yours, someone else would take it from you. And so the boy who had been born with blood in his fist now had blood on his hands, and the steppe, cold and indifferent, continued to spin beneath the stars. Years passed in this way, each one harder than the last. Temujin grew into a young man, lean and fierce, his eyes sharp as winter ice. He was captured once by a rival clan, the Taishiyid, who had once been allies of his father, but now saw him as a threat or perhaps just an inconvenience. They locked him in a wooden collar, a heavy cane that made it impossible to lie down or rest properly, and paraded him from camp to camp as a warning to others. But Temujin did not break. He waited, he watched, and when the moment came, during a celebration when his captors were drunk and distracted, he slipped away into the night, still wearing the cane, and found refuge with a sympathetic family who cut him free. He returned to his mother's camp, not with defeat in his heart, but with something colder, something sharper. He had survived again, and each survival made him stronger. It was around this time that Temujin began to understand something fundamental about the world he lived in. The steppe was not just a place of survival, it was a place of opportunity. Chaos, when properly understood, could be shaped. Weakness, when recognized, could be exploited. And alliances, when carefully built, could become the foundation of something greater than any single tribe. He was no longer the abandoned boy scraping for fish in the riverbanks. He was becoming a man with vision, with purpose, with a hunger that went beyond simple revenge. He wanted more than survival. He wanted mastery. His first significant alliance came through marriage. He had not forgotten Bert, the girl his father had chosen for him all those years ago. When he was old enough, he traveled back to her family and claimed her as his bride. She came willingly, bringing with her a dowry that included a beautiful black sable coat, a treasure on the steppe where such luxuries were rare. Temujin took that coat and did something clever, something that revealed the calculating mind beneath the hardened exterior. He gave it as a gift to Togrul, the Khan of the Carrot tribe, a powerful leader who had once been his father's blood brother. It was a gesture of respect, of loyalty, of strategic humility. And Togrul, moved by the gesture and remembering old bonds, accepted Temujin as a sort of vassal, offering him protection and support. It was a small step, but it was the first rung on a very long ladder. But the step does not let happiness linger. Shortly after his marriage, while Temujin was away from camp, raiders from the Merkit tribe descended on his family. It was revenge, cold and calculated. Years earlier, Yezuge had stolen Holan, Temujin's mother, from a Merkit warrior on her wedding day. Now the Merkits came to balance the scales. They took Bert. They carried her away into the night, and Temujin returned to find his wife gone, his camp in disarray, his honor shattered. For many men, this might have been the end. But for Temujin, it was a beginning. He did not collapse into despair. He turned his grief into fury, his fury into action. He went to Togrul and called in the alliance. He went to his childhood friend, Jamuka, a charismatic leader of another tribe, and asked for his aid. And together, they assembled a force and rode against the Merkits with the kind of focused violence that would become Temujin's signature. The raid was swift and brutal. The Merkits were scattered, their camps burned, their warriors killed or driven into the wilderness. And Bert was recovered. She was pregnant, and there would always be a shadow over the paternity of her first son, Joki, whether he was Temujin's or the child of her captor. But Temujin claimed the boy as his own, and though whispers would follow Joki his entire life, Temujin never publicly wavered. It was another lesson in control, in the management of perception, in the understanding that power was not just about strength, but about the stories people believed. He had rescued his wife. He had crushed his enemies. And in doing so, he had announced to the steppe that he was not a victim anymore. He was a force. For a time, Temujin and Jamuka rode together, two young leaders bound by friendship and shared ambition. They even performed the ritual of Anda, becoming sworn brothers, mixing their blood and vowing eternal loyalty. They camped together, hunted together, shared their dreams beneath the endless sky. But the steppe is not kind to shared power. Slowly, tensions began to grow. Jamuka was charismatic, beloved by many, a natural leader who ruled through charm and tradition. Temujin was different. He was colder, more disciplined, more willing to break with tradition if it served his goals. He promoted men based on loyalty and skill, not bloodline. He listened to the common herders, the outcasts, the people who had been overlooked by the old tribal hierarchies. And people began to choose. Some followed Jamuka. Others, increasingly, followed Temujin. The breaking point came over something small, as it often does. A dispute over stolen horses, a misunderstanding, a moment of pride that could not be swallowed. The two men parted ways, and what had been brotherhood became rivalry. The steppe began to divide between them, and the division would eventually lead to war. But that war was still years away. For now, Temujin focused on building. He gathered followers slowly, carefully, testing their loyalty, rewarding their service, creating a new kind of tribe, one based not on blood, but on merit and mutual benefit. He took in the rejected, the dispossessed, the younger sons who had no inheritance, the warriors who had been cast out by their own clans. He gave them purpose. He gave them belonging, and in return, they gave him their lives. The steppe watched, and the steppe waited. The boy born with blood in his fist was becoming something more. He was becoming a leader. He was becoming a vision. And the cold wind that had shaped him, that had tested him, that had nearly broken him now blew at his back, carrying him forward toward a destiny that no one, not even the shamans, could have fully predicted. The scattered pieces of his life, the betrayals, the suffering, the small victories, the hard-won alliances were beginning to form a pattern. And that pattern, though still incomplete, was starting to look like the outline of an empire. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over the steppe just before a storm. The wind dies, the grass stops moving. Even the animals seem to sense it, their ears pricked, their bodies tense. It is the silence of anticipation, of something enormous gathering itself just beyond the horizon. In the years that followed his break with Jamuka, Temujin existed in that silence. He was building, always building, but he was also waiting for the moment when all the scattered threads of his life would pull tight, when the chaos of the steppe would crystallize into something he could grasp and shape. He was no longer just surviving. He was preparing. His camp grew steadily. Warriors came to him, drawn by his reputation, by the whispers that he was different from other leaders, that he rewarded loyalty above lineage, that he did not ask where you came from but only what you could offer. He created a structure, a discipline that was unusual among the nomadic tribes. His warriors trained constantly, not just in riding and archery, but in coordination, in moving as a single unit, in following commands without hesitation. He organized them into units of 10, then hundreds, then thousands, each with clear leaders, clear roles, clear expectations. It was not the traditional way. The old Khans led through personal charisma, through the force of their individual presence. Temujin was building something else, a system that could function even without him, a machine that could be scaled, expanded, perfected. He was thinking bigger than any of them realized. But he was not without enemies. The steppe is a jealous place, and success breeds resentment as surely as rain breeds grass. Some tried to forge alliances against him. Others launched raids, testing his strength, probing for weakness. And then there were the older powers, the established Khans who had ruled their territories for decades and saw Temujin as an upstart, a disruption to the ancient order. Chief among these was Jamuka, his former blood brother, who had gathered his own coalition of tribes and now stood as Temujin's greatest rival. The two men who had once shared everything now circled each other like wolves, each waiting for the other to stumble. The first major confrontation came at a place called Dalen Balt's Hut. Jamuka assembled a large force, drawing on his alliances and his reputation, and marched against Temujin with the confidence of a man who believed history was on his side. Temujin met him with fewer men, but with better discipline, with warriors who had been drilled and tested, and forged into something sharper than a simple tribal levy. The battle was fierce and bloody, and when the dust settled, Temujin had been forced to retreat. It was a defeat, his first major one, and it stung. But Jamuka made a crucial mistake. In his moment of victory, he ordered 70 of Temujin's captured men to be boiled alive in cauldrons, a brutal display meant to spread fear and assert dominance. Instead, it spread revulsion. Even by the harsh standards of the steppe, it was excessive, cruel, unnecessary. And people began to turn away from Jamuka, quietly, slowly, drifting toward the man who, even in defeat, had maintained his discipline and his dignity. Temujin did not waste his defeat. He learned from it. He absorbed the lesson, studied what had gone wrong, adjusted his strategies. He strengthened his alliances, particularly with Togrul of the Carrot, who saw in Temujin a useful tool, and perhaps something more, a successor, an heir to the power Togrul himself was beginning to lose grip on. Together, they launched campaigns against smaller tribes, absorbing them, expanding their influence, creating a growing sphere of control across the eastern steppe. Temujin was patient. He did not rush. He understood that power built too quickly could collapse just as fast. He needed foundations, deep and unshakable, and he was willing to spend years laying them. But alliances, even the strongest ones, are fragile things. Togrul's son, Sengam, grew jealous of Temujin's influence over his father. He whispered poison in the old Khan's ear, suggesting that Temujin was becoming too powerful, too ambitious, that he would eventually turn on them and take everything. And Togrul, aging and uncertain, began to listen. A plot was hatched to eliminate Temujin, to invite him to a feast and kill him there, quietly, without the mess of open war. But Temujin had spies, loyal men who moved through the camps and heard the whispers. He was warned. And instead of walking into the trap, he vanished into the night, taking his closest followers and disappearing into the wilderness. It was another betrayal, another moment when everything could have ended. But once again, Temujin survived. He retreated to a remote place called Baljuna Lake, a desolate spot where water was scarce and hope even scarcer. It was the lowest point of his life since childhood. His forces were scattered. His allies had turned against him. He had perhaps only a few dozen loyal men left, hungry and exhausted, staring at a future that looked like nothing but slow death or quiet surrender. But there, at the edge of nothing, Temujin did something remarkable. He gathered his remaining followers and made them a promise. He swore an oath, and they swore it with him, that if they survived, if they rose again, they would remember this moment. They would remember who had stayed loyal when everything was lost, and they would be rewarded beyond measure. It became known as the Baljuna Covenant, and the men who drank that muddy water with him became the core of his inner circle, bound not by blood or tribe, but by shared suffering and mutual faith. It was in that moment of absolute defeat that the foundation of an empire was truly laid. Because Temujin had learned the final, most important lesson. Loyalty forged in hardship is stronger than any alliance made in comfort. The steppe is a wheel, always turning. What falls can rise again. Within months, Temujin began to rebuild. His enemies had made a mistake. They had assumed he was finished, and they had turned on each other, squabbling over the scraps of what they thought was his shattered power. But Temujin was not finished. He was sharper now, harder, with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. He reached out to old allies, to tribes that had been conquered by Togrul or Jamuka and chafed under their rule. He offered them something different: respect, inclusion, a share in the victories to come. And slowly, one by one, they came to him. The wheel turned. The storm gathered. And the boy who had been born into the cold wind, who had survived poison and slavery and betrayal and defeat, was about to become something the world had never seen before. Chapter 2: The Unification of the Steppe. The steppe does not forgive. But sometimes, if you are strong enough, clever enough, relentless enough, it allows you to rewrite the story. Temujin emerged from his exile at Baljuna Lake like a man reborn, not softened by defeat, but tempered by it, hardened into something unbreakable. He had lost everything and discovered that even nothing could be a foundation if you refused to let it crush you. Now, with his small band of loyal followers, he began the slow, deliberate work of reclaiming what had been taken from him, and then taking more, always more, until the scattered tribes of Mongolia would have no choice but to bend or break before him. This was not vengeance, though vengeance was part of it. This was transformation. This was the forging of a nation from the raw, chaotic materials of a fractured world. His first target was not Jamukha or Togrul, not yet. He needed to rebuild his strength, to gather numbers, to remind the steppe that he was still a force to be reckoned with. He turned his attention to the smaller tribes, the ones that had been absorbed or bullied by larger powers, the ones that had no great love for their current masters. He sent messengers, not armies, offering them a choice: join him willingly and be treated as equals, or resist and face the consequences. It was a simple calculus, but it was effective. Many chose to join. They had heard the stories of his survival, of his discipline, of his unusual willingness to reward merit over birth. They had heard that when Temujin gave his word, he kept it, and in a world where oaths were broken as easily as pottery, that meant something. Slowly, his camp swelled again. Tents multiplied. Herds grew. Warriors sharpened their blades and waited for orders. But Temujin knew that words alone would not be enough. The steppe respected strength, and strength had to be demonstrated. So he began a series of calculated strikes against those who had wronged him, not in wild fury, but with precision, with the cold efficiency that was becoming his trademark. He attacked supply lines, isolated groups of warriors, vulnerable camps. He did not seek massive battles yet. He sought to erode, to weaken, to make his enemies feel the ground shifting beneath them. And with each small victory, his reputation grew. People began to whisper that he was blessed, that the sky itself had marked him for greatness, that no matter how many times he was knocked down, he would rise again stronger. And in a culture that believed deeply in signs, in omens, in the favor of the eternal blue heaven, those whispers mattered as much as swords. Then came the reckoning with Togrul. The old Khan of the Carrot had betrayed him, had tried to kill him, had driven him into the wilderness. But Togrul was also weakening, his authority challenged by his own son, his alliances fraying. Temujin moved against him with the patience of a hunter stalking prey. He gathered intelligence, learned the positions of Togrul's forces, identified his weaknesses, and when the moment was right, he struck. The campaign against the Carrot was swift and brutal. Temujin's warriors moved like shadows, attacking at night, using the terrain, using fear. Togrul's forces, caught off guard and poorly coordinated, crumbled. The old Khan fled, abandoned by his own men, and died alone in the wilderness, killed by strangers who did not even know who he was. His son Sengam, the architect of the betrayal, was hunted down and killed. The Carrot tribe, one of the most powerful on the steppe, was absorbed into Temujin's growing confederation. It was a turning point. The balance of power had shifted, unmistakably and irreversibly. Jamukha, watching from his own territories, understood what was coming. The two former blood brothers were on a collision course, and there was no longer any room for both of them on the steppe. Jamukha tried to build a coalition, rallying other tribes under the banner of tradition, of the old ways, positioning himself as the defender of tribal independence against Temujin's centralizing vision. And for a while, it seemed like it might work. Several tribes joined him, fearful of what Temujin represented: a new order, a breaking of ancient customs, a world where bloodlines mattered less than loyalty to a single man. But Jamukha made a critical error. He had his followers declare him Gorkhan, universal ruler, a title that smacked of arrogance and overreach. It alienated some of his allies, and it gave Temujin a narrative. Jamukha was a pretender, a man grasping for power he had not earned, while Temujin was simply a leader trying to bring peace and unity to a fractured land. The final confrontation came not in a single grand battle, though there were battles, but in a slow, grinding campaign of attrition. Temujin did not need to destroy Jamukha's forces all at once. He needed only to outlast them, to be more disciplined, more organized, more relentless. He cut off their supplies. He turned their allies. He offered amnesty to warriors who surrendered, but showed no mercy to those who continued to resist. Tribe by tribe, Jamukha's coalition fell apart. His warriors deserted him. His closest advisors began to drift away, sensing the inevitable. And finally, betrayed by his own men who hoped to curry favor with Temujin, Jamukha was captured and brought before his former friend. It must have been a strange moment, the two of them face to face again after so many years of circling each other, of shared history turned to bitter rivalry. Jamukha, to his credit, did not beg. He asked only for an honorable death, without the shedding of blood, as was the custom for nobility. And Temujin, perhaps remembering the boy he had once called brother, granted him that much. Jamukha was executed by having his back broken, his blood kept within his body, and buried with honors. It was mercy of a kind. And it was the end of an era. With Jamukha gone, the steppe exhaled. The great rivalry that had defined a generation, that had split families and tribes and drawn lines across the grasslands, was over. But Temujin did not rest. He understood that victory was not an ending, it was an opportunity, a door that opened onto a larger room. The tribes that had followed Jamukha were leaderless now, adrift, vulnerable. And Temujin moved quickly to gather them in, not as conquered peoples, but as integrated parts of something larger. He did not simply crush and move on. He absorbed. He assimilated. He built. His method was both ruthless and surprisingly enlightened. To the common warriors, to the herders and craftsmen and ordinary families, he offered inclusion. Join us, he said, and you will be protected. You will have a voice. You will rise according to your abilities, not your ancestry. It was a radical proposition in a world where your birth determined almost everything. But to the old nobility, to the chiefs and khans who had ruled through bloodline and tradition, he was far less forgiving. Those who had actively opposed him, who had shed the blood of his followers, who had broken their oaths, they were eliminated, their families scattered or absorbed, their names erased from the memory of the steppe. It was a calculated purge, designed not just to remove threats, but to send a message. The old order was dead. A new one was being born. And in this new order, loyalty to the unified whole mattered more than any ancient claim to power. The tribes began to merge, boundaries dissolving like morning frost under the sun. The Mongols, the Carrot, the Naaman, the Tatars, all the names that had once meant separate identities, separate loyalties, separate wars, were becoming something else. Not yet a nation, not in the way we understand it today, but a confederation, a collective bound by shared law, shared purpose, shared leadership. Temujin established a code, a set of rules that applied to everyone, noble and commoner alike. Theft was punished. Adultery was punished. Betrayal was punished. But loyalty was rewarded, courage was celebrated, and merit was recognized. He promoted men from the lowest ranks to positions of command if they proved themselves capable. He created a personal guard, the keshig, composed of the sons of his commanders, ensuring loyalty while also training the next generation of leaders. Every decision, every structure was deliberate, designed to strengthen the whole while binding individuals to the center to him. There was one more great obstacle, one final power that stood between Temujin and complete dominance of the steppe: the Naiman tribe. They controlled the western regions, a vast territory rich in grazing lands and trade routes, and they were led by a Khan named Taiyang, a proud man who saw Temujin as an upstart, a barbarian from the east who had gotten lucky. Taiyang gathered his forces, confident in his numbers and his position, and prepared to crush this Mongol upstart once and for all. His advisors warned him to be cautious, told him that Temujin was not like other enemies, that his warriors were disciplined and his strategies cunning. But Taiyang dismissed their concerns. He had the larger army. He had the high ground. He had tradition on his side. How could he lose? The battle took place in the foothills of the Altai Mountains, a place where the grasslands gave way to rocky slopes and narrow valleys. Temujin studied the terrain carefully, as he always did, and made his plan. He divided his forces, sending smaller units to harass the Naiman flanks, to create confusion, to make Taiyang's army stretch and shift to respond. Then, when the moment was right, when the Naiman forces were disorganized and off balance, Temujin struck with his main force, driving straight into the center like a blade between ribs. The Naiman warriors, brave as they were, could not withstand the coordinated assault. They broke. They scattered. Taiyang himself was killed in the fighting, and his son fled into the mountains with the remnants of the army, only to be hunted down and destroyed in the weeks that followed. The Naiman were finished, and with them, the last significant resistance on the Mongolian steppe collapsed. It was 1206, a year that would be remembered as long as people told stories of empires and conquerors. In the spring, when the grass was green and the rivers were full, the tribes gathered at the headwaters of the Anan River, a place sacred to the Mongols, beneath the eternal blue sky. They came in their thousands, warriors, chiefs, shamans, families, all converging on a single place for a single purpose. A great Kuriltai was convened, a gathering of all the tribes, and there, in a ceremony that was both ancient and entirely new, they proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan, a title that has echoed through history as Genghis Khan. It meant universal ruler, Oceanic Khan, a leader whose authority was as vast and boundless as the sea. It was not just a promotion, it was a transformation. The man who had been born as Temujin, who had survived abandonment and slavery and betrayal, who had clawed his way up from nothing, was now the undisputed master of the steppe. But the title was not an ending. It was a beginning. Genghis Khan stood before his people and laid out a vision that went far beyond the grasslands they knew. He spoke of unity, of strength, of a future where the Mongol people would not merely survive but thrive, where they would not be content with their small corner of the world but would reach out and take what they needed, what they deserved. He established laws, the Yasa, a legal code that would govern not just the Mongols but all peoples who came under their rule. He organized the army into a structure that could expand infinitely, tens, hundreds, thousands, tumens of 10,000 warriors, each all moving with the precision of a single weapon. He appointed his most loyal followers to positions of authority, rewarding those who had stood by him at Baljuna, ensuring that merit and loyalty would always triumph over birth. And he looked beyond the horizon, toward the settled kingdoms to the south and west, toward cities and empires that had never heard of the Mongols, and he began to plan. The unification of the steppe was not merely a political achievement, it was a miracle of will, of vision sustained against impossible odds. For centuries, the tribes of Mongolia had lived in a cycle of raid and counter-raid, alliance and betrayal, rising briefly only to fracture again into their constituent parts. It was the nature of nomadic life, where mobility was survival and loyalty was always negotiable. But Genghis Khan had broken that cycle. He had taken the chaos and hammered it into order, not by erasing tribal identities entirely, but by layering something stronger on top of them, a shared identity, a Mongol identity that transcended the old divisions. And more than that, he had given them a purpose, a direction, a hunger that looked outward rather than inward. The steppe, for the first time in its long history, was not at war with itself, it was unified. And that unity, once forged, would prove to be one of the most formidable forces the world had ever known. But unity alone was not enough. Genghis Khan understood that a people defined only by warfare would eventually turn on themselves once there were no more external enemies to fight. He needed to channel that energy, to give his warriors something to do, somewhere to go, a constant forward momentum that would keep the machine he had built from grinding against itself. And so he turned his gaze to the lands beyond the steppe, to the kingdoms and empires that had always looked down on the nomads as barbarians, as crude horse herders fit only to be raided or ignored. He would teach them a different lesson. He would show them that the steppe was not a backwater, it was a forge. And what had been forged, there was about to reshape the world. His first target was carefully chosen. Not the greatest empire, not yet, but a wealthy and vulnerable one, the Western Shia, a kingdom that lay along the trade routes bordering the Gobi Desert, a place of oasis cities and farming communities ruled by a people called the Tanguts. They were rich, complacent, protected by walls and treaties, secure in the belief that the desert itself was their best defense. Genghis Khan studied them, sent spies, learned their strengths and weaknesses, and then struck with devastating speed. His armies moved through the desert like ghosts, appearing where they were not expected, bypassing fortresses to strike at vulnerable cities, cutting off supply lines, spreading terror. The Tanguts, accustomed to dealing with raiders they could buy off or intimidate, found themselves facing something entirely different, a coordinated, disciplined invasion led by a man who did not negotiate, who did not retreat, who would accept nothing less than total submission. City after city fell. Some surrendered quickly, hoping for mercy. Others resisted and were destroyed, their population slaughtered or enslaved, their wealth carried back to the steppe. Genghis Khan was establishing a pattern, a reputation. Surrender and live, resist and die. It was brutal, but it was also pragmatic. He did not have the numbers to occupy every city, to garrison every fortress. He needed fear to do the work for him, needed the word to spread faster than his armies could ride, so that the next city would think twice, would consider carefully whether their walls and their pride were worth the price. And it worked. By the time the campaign against the Western Shah concluded, the kingdom had been effectively neutered, reduced to a vassal state that would pay tribute and provide supplies for future campaigns. It was not a complete conquest, not yet, but it was a beginning. The Mongols had tasted wealth beyond the steppe, and they wanted more. As his armies returned laden with silk and silver, with craftsmen and engineers and treasure, Genghis Khan was already planning the next move. To the east lay the greatest prize of all, the Jin dynasty, the empire that ruled northern China, a civilization ancient and sophisticated, with walled cities that stretched to the horizon, with armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, with a culture that looked upon the Mongols as little more than animals on horseback. The Jin had once demanded tribute from the Mongol tribes, had played them against each other, had treated them with contempt. Genghis Khan had not forgotten. And now, with the steppe united behind him, with an army that had been tested and proven, he was ready to make the Jin pay for every insult, every humiliation, every ounce of arrogance. But before the invasion could begin, there was one more piece of unfinished business. The Tatars, the tribe that had poisoned his father all those years ago, still existed, scattered and weakened, but not destroyed. Genghis Khan could not let that debt remain unpaid. He gathered his forces and fell upon the Tatars with a fury that was personal, visceral, absolute. The campaign was not a war, it was an extermination. Every Tatar male taller than the axle of a cart was killed. The women and children were absorbed into Mongol families, their identity erased, their name removed from the roll of tribes. It was genocide, calculated and complete, a message written in blood. Betray the Khan. Harm his family, and not even your memory will survive. The steppe watched, and the steppe understood. This was not a leader who forgave. This was not a leader who forgot. With the Tatars gone and the Western Shia subdued, Genghis Khan stood at the peak of his power on the steppe. He was 50 years old, an age when most men were thinking of rest, of handing power to their sons, of watching grandchildren grow. But Genghis Khan was not most men. He was just beginning. The unification of the steppe had been the work of a lifetime, a slow and painful climb from the ashes of his childhood to the throne of a nation that had never existed before. But now that throne was secure. The foundation was laid, the machine was built, and it was time to turn it loose upon the world. The grasslands that had raised him, that had tested him, that had nearly killed him a dozen times over, now stood behind him as a single, unified force. The boy who had clutched blood in his fist at birth had become the man who would spill rivers of it across continents. And the steppe, cold and eternal, watched him ride south toward the walls of empires that did not yet know their fate had already been sealed. Chapter 3. The War Machine. There is a difference between an army and a war machine. An army is a gathering of warriors bound by courage and leadership, capable of great feats but limited by the sum of its individual parts. A war machine is something else entirely. It is a system, a living organism designed for a single purpose: to conquer, to adapt, to overwhelm anything in its path. What Genghis Khan built on the steppes of Mongolia was not merely an army. It was the most efficient, most terrifying instrument of warfare the medieval world had ever seen. And it was this machine, more than any single battle or any moment of personal genius, that would allow a nation of nomadic herders to bring empires to their knees and redraw the map of the known world. At the heart of the machine was the horse. Not just any horse, but the small, stocky, incredibly resilient Mongol pony, an animal that could survive on sparse grass, could run for days with minimal rest, could carry a warrior across terrain that would break larger breeds. Every Mongol warrior had multiple horses, sometimes 4 or 5, rotating them throughout a campaign so that no single animal was ever exhausted. This gave the Mongol army a mobility that was almost supernatural by the standards of the time. They could cover 100 miles in a day when necessary, appearing where no army should be able to appear, striking and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. European knights, weighed down by armor and riding destriers bred for power rather than endurance, could barely comprehend how the Mongols moved. It was as if they were fighting ghosts, shadows that materialized and dissolved at will. But the horse was only the beginning. The Mongol warrior himself was a weapon forged from childhood. Boys learned to ride before they could walk properly, learned to shoot a bow from the saddle before they could read or write. Their training was not formal, not organized in barracks or academies, but woven into the fabric of daily life. Hunting was training, herding was training. The seasonal migrations, the constant movement, the necessity of vigilance in a harsh land, all of it prepared them for war. By the time a Mongol boy reached fighting age, he was already a cavalry archer of devastating skill, capable of hitting a target at full gallop, able to wheel and fire and reload in seconds, a master of the most difficult martial art the pre-modern world possessed. And they did not fight as individuals. They fought as units, as coordinated waves, each warrior knowing his place, trusting his companions, moving in patterns that had been drilled into them through endless practice and the unforgiving discipline of Genghis Khan's command structure. The organization of the army was elegantly simple and infinitely scalable. At the lowest level was the arban, a unit of 10 men, each man responsible to the others, each success or failure shared collectively. 10 arbans made a zuan, 100. 10 zuans made a mingan, 1,000. And 10 mingans made a tumen, 10,000 warriors, the basic building block of Mongol military power. Each level had its commander, chosen for skill and loyalty rather than birth. And each commander had absolute authority over his unit, but was also absolutely accountable to the next level up. It was a pyramid of power that concentrated at the top in the person of the Khan, but distributed authority and initiative throughout the ranks. A Mingan commander could make tactical decisions without waiting for orders from above, could adapt to the battlefield in real time, but always within the framework of the overall strategy. It was flexible and rigid at once, capable of independent action but bound by iron discipline. Nothing like it existed anywhere else in the world. The tactics themselves were devastatingly effective. The Mongols did not believe in fair fights or honorable combat. They believed in winning, quickly and completely, with the fewest possible casualties to their own forces. They used deception, constantly feigned retreats that drew enemy forces out of position, fake camps that made their numbers seem larger or smaller than they were, captured uniforms and banners to create confusion. They used scouts and spies extensively, gathering intelligence on enemy movements, terrain, morale, always knowing more about their opponents than their opponents knew about them. And when battle was joined, they fought with a fluidity that bewildered their enemies. They would circle at a distance, raining arrows down with mechanical precision, whittling down formations, targeting officers and horses, creating chaos. If the enemy charged, they would scatter and reform, leading pursuers into ambushes. If the enemy held position, they would probe for weaknesses, hammer at the flanks, wait for exhaustion or frustration to create an opening. And when that opening came, when the enemy line finally broke or wavered, the Mongols would strike with their heavy cavalry, smashing through with lances and sabers, turning retreat into rout, rout into slaughter. But perhaps the most terrifying weapon in the Mongol arsenal was psychological, fear. Genghis Khan understood that reputation was a force multiplier, that if people believed you were invincible, unstoppable, merciless, then half the battle was already won before a single arrow was loosed. So he cultivated that reputation carefully and deliberately. Cities that surrendered immediately were treated relatively well. They paid tribute, provided supplies, perhaps sent craftsmen or soldiers to join the Mongol cause. But their populations were largely spared. Cities that resisted, however, faced annihilation. The Mongols would breach the walls, pour inside, and systematically slaughter every living thing: men, women, children, animals. Buildings were burned, treasures looted, and in some cases, the ruins were salted so nothing would grow there again. Then survivors would be sent out, traumatized refugees who would spread the word of what had happened, carrying the terror like a plague to the next city, the next kingdom. By the time the Mongol army arrived at a new target, the inhabitants had already heard the stories, already knew what awaited them if they chose to fight. Many chose not to. Many opened their gates and begged for mercy. And the Mongol war machine rolled on, fed not just by horses and arrows, but by the spreading shadow of its own legend. The invasion of the Jin dynasty began in 1211, and it was unlike anything the Chinese had ever experienced. The Jin were not unprepared. They had vast armies, fortified cities, sophisticated military traditions stretching back centuries. Their generals had studied the classics of warfare, understood siege tactics, commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They looked at the Mongols and saw what everyone else saw: barbarians on horseback, numerous perhaps, fierce certainly, but ultimately unsophisticated, incapable of taking walled cities, doomed to exhaust themselves against the immovable weight of Chinese civilization. They were wrong. Catastrophically, fatally wrong. Genghis Khan did not simply throw his warriors at the walls and hope for the best. He adapted. He learned. He brought with him engineers, many of them captured during earlier campaigns or recruited from conquered territories. Men who understood siege warfare, who knew how to build trebuchets and siege towers, who could undermine walls or divert rivers. He studied the Chinese defenses, probed for weaknesses, used his mobility to strike where the Jin could not quickly respond. While one Mongol force besieged a major city, others would sweep through the countryside, destroying crops, cutting supply lines, forcing the Jin armies to divide their attention, to stretch themselves thin trying to defend everything. And then, when the Jin forces finally gathered to meet the Mongols in open battle, they would find themselves facing an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. The Mongols would skirmish, harass, retreat, draw the Chinese forces out, exhaust them, and then strike from unexpected angles with devastating precision. The first major victory came at the Battle of Yehuling, where a Jin army of perhaps 100,000 men marched through a mountain pass to intercept the Mongol invasion. Genghis Khan led them enter the pass, let them commit their forces to the narrow defile, and then closed the trap. Mongol warriors attacked from the heights, raining arrows down on the packed formations below, while other units blocked the exits. The Jin soldiers, unable to maneuver, unable to use their numbers effectively, were slaughtered. Tens of thousands died in a single day, and the survivors fled back to their fortresses, their confidence shattered, their belief in their own invincibility crumbling like dust. The news spread through the Jin territories like wildfire. The Mongols were not just raiders. They were destroyers. They were the end of worlds. City after city fell. Some quickly, betrayed from within by merchants or officials, who saw the writing on the wall and chose survival over loyalty. Others slowly starved out or pounded into submission by siege engines that hurled stones and fire day and night until the walls cracked and the defenders' spirits broke. Genghis Khan was patient when he needed to be, ruthless when patience served no purpose. He left devastation in his wake, not out of mindless cruelty, but as a calculated strategy. Burn the farms, and the cities starve. Kill the artisans, and the weapons stop being made. Slaughter the officials, and the administration collapses. He was not just defeating armies, he was dismantling the infrastructure that allowed empires to function. And the Jin, for all their sophistication, for all their ancient wisdom, had no answer to it. Their world was being systematically unraveled by men they had barely considered human. But the Mongols did not only destroy, they also absorbed. This was the genius that set them apart from simple conquerors. When they took a city, they looked for what was useful. Skilled craftsmen, metalworkers, engineers, doctors, scribes were spared and sent back to Mongolia or integrated into the army. Siege engineers from China taught the Mongols techniques they had never known. Merchants who knew the trade routes, who understood currencies and contracts, were employed to manage the flow of goods. Even soldiers, if they surrendered and proved their loyalty, could find themselves fighting under the Mongol banner. Their skills and local knowledge turned against their former masters. Genghis Khan had no interest in purity of blood or cultural superiority. He cared only about effectiveness. If you had something to offer, if you could strengthen the machine, then your origin did not matter. You were Mongol now, not by birth but by choice and utility. It was a kind of meritocracy born from pragmatism, and it made the Mongol Empire extraordinarily adaptable, able to learn from every people it encountered, to incorporate every advantage, to grow stronger with each conquest. By 1215, the Mongols stood before the walls of Chengdu, the Jin capital, the great city that would one day be called Beijing. It was one of the largest, most heavily fortified cities in the world, surrounded by massive walls, defended by elite troops, stocked with supplies meant to last for years. The Jin emperor had retreated there, confident that whatever happened in the countryside, the capital at least was impregnable. Genghis Khan studied those walls and considered his options. A direct assault would be costly, perhaps impossible. But he did not need to take the city by storm. He needed only to take it, so he waited. He encircled the city, cutting it off from the outside world, and let time do the work. Months passed. Food grew scarce. Disease spread through the crowded streets. Morale crumbled. Factions within the city began to turn on each other, blaming everyone for their predicament. And when the gates finally opened, it was not because the Mongols had broken through, but because the defenders had broken themselves. The city was looted for weeks, its treasures carried away, its population scattered or enslaved. The Jin dynasty, though not yet completely destroyed, was finished as a great power. And Genghis Khan, standing in the ruins of their capital, had proven beyond any doubt that walls and civilization and ancient heritage meant nothing against the war machine he had built. The conquest of the Jin took years, and even then it was not complete. The remnants of the dynasty would cling to life in the south for decades. But Genghis Khan was not interested in mopping up. He had proven his point. He had shown that the Mongol army could break any defense, could defeat any enemy, no matter how numerous or how established. And now his gaze turned westward, toward lands even more distant, toward kingdoms that had never heard the thunder of Mongol hooves, toward a world that was about to discover just how small and fragile it really was. The war machine had been tested. It had been perfected, and it was ready to devour continents. There is a rhythm to conquest, a cadence that successful empires understand instinctively. Push too hard, too fast, and the machine breaks supply lines stretch. Soldiers exhaust, subject peoples rebel. Move too slowly, and momentum is lost. Enemies regroup. The fire that drives expansion begins to cool. Genghis Khan understood this rhythm better than perhaps any conqueror before or since. He knew when to press forward and when to consolidate, when to terrify and when to offer mercy, when to lead from the front and when to delegate to his generals. The war machine he had built was not just a collection of warriors and tactics, it was a philosophy. A way of thinking about power and violence and control that could be applied anywhere, against anyone. And as the Mongols turned westward, that philosophy would be tested against civilizations utterly different from anything they had encountered before. The catalyst came from an unexpected place. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan to the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast Islamic state that stretched across Central Asia, encompassing modern-day Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and parts of Afghanistan. The caravan carried silk and jade, gold and furs, gifts and proposals for peaceful trade between two great powers. But the governor of the border city of Otrar, a man named Anulhuk, saw the caravan and saw only opportunity. He accused the merchants of being spies, seized their goods, and executed them all. It was greed, perhaps, or paranoia, or simply the arrogance of a man who could not imagine that his actions might have consequences. When word reached Genghis Khan, he did what protocol demanded. He sent ambassadors to the Shah of Khwarezm, Muhammad II, demanding justice, demanding that Anulhuk be handed over for punishment. The Shah, either intimidated by the governor or unwilling to appear weak, refused. Worse, he had one of the Mongol ambassadors killed and sent the others back with their beards shaved, a profound insult in both Mongol and Islamic culture. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Shah had just declared war on a force he did not understand, could not comprehend, and would not survive. Genghis Khan's response was methodical, almost ritualistic. He climbed alone to a mountain, prayed to the eternal blue sky for 3 days, and when he descended, he gave the order. The Mongol war machine turned west, not with a raiding party, not with a punitive expedition, but with the full weight of the empire. For Tumen's 40,000 warriors of the finest cavalry the world had ever seen rode toward Khwarezm, and with them came engineers, siege experts, scouts, spies, and a cold, patient fury that would not be satisfied until an entire civilization had been erased. The Shah had an army that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. He had fortified cities, experienced generals, wealth beyond measure. None of it would matter. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire was not just a military campaign, it was a demonstration, a lesson written in fire and blood for the entire world to read. The Mongols did not follow predictable routes or conventional strategies. They divided their forces, moving through terrain that was supposed to be impassable, appearing in multiple places at once, creating the illusion of an army far larger than it actually was. They used psychological warfare with surgical precision. Before attacking a city, they would send agents ahead to spread rumors, to exaggerate their numbers, to describe in vivid detail what had happened to cities that resisted. By the time the Mongol army actually arrived, the population was already half defeated by their own fear. And when cities fell, and they always fell, the Mongols would occasionally let a few survivors escape, traumatized witnesses who would flee to the next city and spread the terror even further. It was brutally efficient. It saved Mongol lives. And it worked. The city of Bukhara, one of the great centers of Islamic learning, surrendered after only a brief siege. Genghis Khan himself rode into the main mosque, not to pray, but to speak. He stood before the assembled leaders and scholars and told them, simply and without emotion, that he was the punishment of God, sent because of their sins. Whether he believed it or whether it was theater designed to break their spirits, the effect was the same. Bukhara was looted, its treasures divided among the warriors, its population enslaved or scattered. The great library, containing centuries of knowledge, was burned. Samarkand, another jewel of Central Asian civilization, fell shortly after. The Shah's armies, massive on paper, were never able to coordinate effectively. They were outmaneuvered, ambushed, picked apart piece by an enemy that refused to fight in predictable ways. And the Shah himself, the man whose pride had started this catastrophe, fled from city to city, watching his empire collapse around him, until finally he died alone on an island in the Caspian Sea, broken and forgotten while the Mongols hunted down his son and finished what they had started. The destruction was staggering, almost incomprehensible in scale. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for generations were deliberately destroyed, turning fertile lands into deserts. Populations that numbered in the millions were slaughtered, enslaved, or scattered into refugee columns that trudged across wastelands with nowhere to go. Historians still debate the exact death toll. Some say hundreds of thousands, others millions, but the numbers, vast as they are, cannot capture the totality of what was lost. This was not just conquest. This was the systematic dismantling of a civilization, the erasure of a cultural and economic powerhouse, the replacement of order with void. And it was all because one governor had been too greedy and one Shah too proud to understand that the world had changed, that a new power had risen in the East, and that power did not forgive insults. Yet even in the midst of this devastation, the Mongol war machine continued to evolve. Genghis Khan divided his forces, sending two of his best generals, Jib and Subutai, on a reconnaissance in force around the Caspian Sea. These two commanders, with perhaps 20,000 men, rode through the Caucasus, defeated a Georgian army, swept into the steppes north of the Black Sea, and smashed a combined force of Russian princes and their Cuman allies at the Battle of the Kalka River. Then, having traveled thousands of miles through unknown territory, having defeated enemies they had never encountered before, they calmly rode back to rejoin the main army. It was a feat of endurance and military skill that stunned contemporaries and still amazes historians today. It was also a warning, though few in Europe recognized it at the time. The Mongols had reached the edge of Christendom, had tested its defenses, had measured its strength. And they had found it wanting, for now they withdrew. But the war machine had tasted the West, and it had learned. In the years to come, it would return. And when it did, Europe would discover what the Khwarezmian Empire, the Jin dynasty, and countless others had already learned, that walls and faith and ancient glory meant nothing before the cold efficiency of the force that Genghis Khan had forged on the frozen steppes of Mongolia. Chapter 4: The Silk Road and the Age of Exchange. Empires are remembered for their conquests, for the battles won and the cities taken, for the names of generals and the dates of decisive victories. But the true measure of an empire is not always found in its violence. Sometimes it is found in the quiet spaces between wars, in the roads that connect distant lands, in the merchants who travel safely where once they feared for their lives, in the ideas that flow like water across borders that used to be walls. The Mongol Empire, born in blood and forged through relentless conquest, became something unexpected in its maturity. It became a bridge, a vast, spanning connection between East and West, between cultures that had existed for centuries in mutual ignorance or hostility. And in doing so, it changed the world in ways that outlasted every battle, every conquest, every Khan who ever ruled. This is the story of the Silk Road reborn, of the Pax Mongolica, of the age when the world, for a brief and shining moment, became smaller and more interconnected than it had ever been before. The Silk Road was not new. It had existed in various forms for over 1,000 years, a network of trade routes stretching from China through Central Asia to the Mediterranean, carrying silk and spices and precious goods, along with ideas and religions and technologies. But it had never been safe. Bandits haunted the mountain passes. Rival kingdoms taxed merchants until there was barely any profit left. Wars closed routes for years at a time. Traveling from one end of Asia to the other was a journey that might take years and might very well end in death. Merchants accepted these risks because the rewards were extraordinary. Chinese silk could sell in Rome for prices that defied imagination, and European glassware or Middle Eastern metalwork commanded fortunes in Chang'an. But it was always dangerous, always uncertain, always fragmented into 100 small journeys rather than one continuous route. Then came the Mongols, and everything changed. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia. It was the largest contiguous land empire in history, and within its borders, a single law prevailed, the law of the Great Khan. Trade was not just permitted, it was encouraged, protected, systematized. Genghis Khan and his successors understood something fundamental about power, that wealth was as important as military strength, that a thriving economy could sustain armies and build cities and ensure loyalty in ways that fear alone never could. So they made the roads safe. They established way stations, yams, spaced at regular intervals across the empire, where travelers could rest, change horses, and resupply. They created a system of passports, bronze tablets called pesa, that guaranteed safe passage to merchants and diplomats. They stationed soldiers along the routes to suppress bandits. They standardized weights and measures, established fair taxation, and punished anyone who preyed on legitimate trade. For the first time in history, a merchant could theoretically travel from Beijing to Baghdad, from Samarkand to the Black Sea, under the protection of a single authority that spanned continents. And travel they did. The Silk Road roared back to life like a river after a long drought. Caravans multiplied, their camels and wagons laden with goods that represented the wealth of 3 continents. From China came silk, of course, but also porcelain, tea, paper, and lacquerware. From Central Asia came horses, jade, and precious stones. From Persia and the Islamic world came glassware, carpets, scientific instruments, and books. From Europe, what little reached this far, came woolen cloth, furs, and silver. But the trade was not just in physical goods. It was in knowledge, in techniques, in ideas that could not be weighed or taxed, but that changed societies as profoundly as any army. Paper-making technology, which had been a closely guarded Chinese secret, spread westward. Printing techniques followed. Gunpowder, that terrible invention that would reshape warfare forever, began its slow journey from east to west. The compass, mathematical concepts, astronomical charts, all of these moved along the Silk Road, carried not by conquerors, but by merchants and scholars and travelers who found, for the first time, that the world was open to them. The Mongols themselves were not great innovators or inventors. They created little in the way of art or literature or philosophy. But they were extraordinary collectors, adopters, adapters. They saw value everywhere and took it, incorporated it, spread it further. When they conquered China, they absorbed Chinese administrative techniques. When they conquered Persia, they brought Persian engineers and scholars back to Mongolia and sent them throughout the empire. They employed Muslim traders to manage their finances, Christian scribes to keep their records, Buddhist monks to advise on spiritual matters. The Mongol court became one of the most cosmopolitan places on earth, a gathering point for people from every corner of the known world, all serving the Khan, all contributing their skills to the maintenance of the empire. It was pragmatism elevated to an art form, and it worked. The empire functioned not despite its diversity, but because of it, each conquered people adding something to the whole, strengthening the structure that held it all together. And the flow of people was not just one way. Europeans, tentatively at first and then with growing confidence, began to venture into the Mongol domains. Missionaries arrived, hoping to convert the Khan to Christianity, dreaming of a vast Christian empire in the East that might ally with Europe against the Islamic world. They were disappointed. The Mongols were religiously tolerant, but not particularly interested in conversion, but they wrote accounts of what they saw, and those accounts filtered back to Europe, sparking imaginations, challenging assumptions. Merchants followed, men like the Polo family of Venice, who would spend years in the service of Kublai Khan and return with stories that seemed like fantasies to their contemporaries. Young Marco Polo described cities of unimaginable size, technologies Europe had never seen, wealth beyond European comprehension. Many did not believe him. They called his book a collection of lies, dismissed him as a fabulist. But he was telling the truth, or most of it. The East was that advanced, that wealthy, that far ahead in so many ways. And the Mongol Empire, for all its brutality, had made it possible for a Venetian teenager to see it with his own eyes and return home to tell the tale. The movement of goods and people created something even more profound than wealth. It created understanding, tentative and incomplete perhaps, but real nonetheless. For centuries, the civilizations of Europe and Asia had existed in a state of mutual mythology. Each imagined the other as exotic, strange, almost alien. The Chinese knew of the Roman Empire only as a distant land called Daichin, a place of conjecture and rumor. Europeans spoke of Cathay and the Indies as if they were lands from fairy tales, places where anything might be true. But now, under Mongol rule, the myths were being replaced by reality. Travelers brought back not just stories but evidence, not just impressions but detailed observations. They described the mechanics of Chinese printing presses, the sophistication of Persian astronomy, the administrative efficiency of Mongol governance. They noted differences in agriculture, in architecture, in social customs. And slowly, gradually, the map of the world in the human mind began to fill in, to become more accurate, more complete, more real. The religious exchanges were particularly fascinating. The Mongols practiced a form of shamanism inherited from their steppe ancestors, a belief system centered on the eternal blue sky and the spirits that inhabited the natural world. But they were remarkably tolerant of other faiths, seeing them as different paths to similar truths, or perhaps simply as politically useful tools for managing diverse populations. Buddhism had already spread along the Silk Road centuries earlier, but under Mongol rule, it found new patronage, new monasteries, new translations of sacred texts. Islam, the dominant religion in much of Central Asia and Persia, continued to flourish, and many Mongols in the Western territories eventually converted, adopting not just the faith, but the administrative and cultural systems that came with it. Christianity, in its various forms, Nestorian, Orthodox, Catholic, found a foothold in the Mongol court, and for a brief time there was genuine hope in Europe that the Mongols might become Christian allies against the Muslim world. That hope was never realized, but the fact that it existed at all was remarkable. Nestorian Christian communities thrived in Central Asia under Mongol protection. The Mongols employed Christian scribes and administrators, married Christian princesses, built churches in their capital at Karakoram. There were moments of genuine religious dialogue, of mutual curiosity, when monks from Tibet debated with priests from Rome in the court of the Khan, when Muslim scholars translated Greek philosophy into Arabic and Persian scholars translated it into Mongolian. It was messy, incomplete, often superficial, but it was happening. Ideas were colliding, mixing, creating something new. The world was not uniting, it was too vast, too diverse for that, but it was communicating in ways it never had before. Technology flowed along these same routes, changing societies in ways both obvious and subtle. Chinese innovations in agriculture, new strains of rice, improved irrigation techniques, spread westward and increased crop yields in Persia and beyond. Islamic advances in mathematics, particularly the concept of zero and the decimal system inherited from India, moved eastward into China and eventually influenced Chinese computational methods. Medical knowledge crossed borders in both directions. Persian and Arab physicians brought their understanding of anatomy and pharmacology to China. Chinese herbal medicine and acupuncture techniques filtered westward, often misunderstood but occasionally adopted. Metallurgy improved as techniques from different regions were compared and combined. The Mongols, always practical, facilitated these exchanges deliberately, bringing craftsmen from conquered territories to work in different parts of the empire, cross-pollinating skills and knowledge in a kind of forced but effective innovation. The most consequential technological transfer was probably gunpowder. The Chinese had been using it for centuries, primarily in fireworks and simple fire weapons, but the knowledge was closely guarded. Under Mongol rule, that knowledge spread. Persian and Arab engineers experimented with it, refined it, began to understand its military potential more fully. The Mongols themselves incorporated gunpowder weapons into their sieges, using primitive bombs and fire lances alongside their traditional tactics. And eventually, the knowledge reached Europe, where it would be developed into cannon and firearms, weapons that would revolutionize warfare and ultimately render the armored knight obsolete. It is one of history's great ironies that the Mongols, whose power was built on the horse and the bow, facilitated the spread of the technology that would eventually make cavalry charges suicidal and transform the nature of war forever. But perhaps the most important thing that traveled the Silk Road was not a technology or a trade good or even an idea. It was possibility. The knowledge that the world was larger, more diverse, more interconnected than anyone had imagined. European scholars who read the accounts of travelers to the East began to dream of what else might be out there, what other lands might exist, what other routes might connect them. Chinese officials who dealt with European and Middle Eastern visitors began to understand that their empire, vast as it was not the entirety of civilization. The psychological shift was subtle but profound. The world was no longer a collection of isolated civilizations surrounded by barbarians. It was a network, a web of connections, a single system in which every part affected every other part. The Mongols had not intended to create this realization. They were interested in tribute and control. Not philosophy, but they created it nonetheless, simply by holding together such an enormous territory for long enough that people could move through it and see what lay beyond their own horizons. Of course, it was not all enlightenment and mutual understanding. The Mongol Empire was built on conquest and maintained by the threat of violence. The merchants who traveled the Silk Road in safety did so because the roads were patrolled by soldiers who had destroyed cities and slaughtered populations. The tolerance for different religions was pragmatic, not philosophical. The Mongols did not persecute faiths because they did not care deeply about theology, not because they believed in some abstract principle of freedom of conscience. The flow of goods enriched some but impoverished others, as local industries were undercut by imported products or as traditional trade routes were redirected to suit Mongol interests. And the very connectedness that brought so many benefits would eventually bring catastrophe, as diseases, particularly the Black Death, would follow the same trade routes that carried silk and spices, spreading from Asia to Europe and killing tens of millions. The Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, was real, but it was a peace built on the foundation of empire, and like all empires, it had costs that not everyone paid equally. There was a moment, perhaps around the middle of the 13th century, when a person could stand in the marketplace of Samarkand or Tabriz or Karakoram and see the whole world in miniature. Chinese merchants in silk robes haggling with Persian traders in embroidered coats. European envoys in travel-stained woolens presenting letters to Mongol officials who could barely read, but employed scribes who read a dozen languages. Buddhist monks in saffron conversing with Nestorian priests in black, while Muslim scholars debated points of astronomy with Confucian administrators. The air would have been thick with languages: Mongolian, Chinese, Persian, Arabic, Turkish, Russian, Italian, a cacophony that somehow resolved itself into commerce, into understanding, into the daily miracle of people from utterly different worlds finding common ground in the simple need to trade, to communicate, to survive together. It was chaotic and noisy and probably smelled terrible, but it was also extraordinary. For that brief window of time, the Silk Road was not just a trade route. It was a laboratory of human possibility, a demonstration that diversity could be managed, that distance could be overcome, that the barriers people erected between themselves were not as solid as they seemed. The Mongol postal system, the Yam, deserves particular attention because it was one of the empire's most impressive administrative achievements. Way stations were established every 20 to 30 miles along major routes, stocked with fresh horses, food, and supplies. Messengers carrying the Khan's pesa could requisition whatever they needed and ride on immediately, covering distances at speeds that would not be matched until the age of railroads. A message could travel from Beijing to the western edge of the empire in a matter of weeks, not months. This allowed the Khan to maintain control over vast distances, to know what was happening in distant provinces, to respond to threats or opportunities with a speed that astonished contemporaries. But the system was not just for official business. Merchants with the proper documentation could use it. Diplomats and envoys used it. Scholars and missionaries used it. It became the nervous system of the empire, carrying information and goods and people at speeds that seemed almost magical to those accustomed to the slow, dangerous travel of earlier centuries. The cultural synthesis that occurred under Mongol rule produced some unexpected fruits. In Persia, the Mongol Ilkhanate that ruled there eventually converted to Islam, but they brought with them administrative techniques and artistic influences from China. Persian miniature painting began to incorporate Chinese motifs, dragons, phoenixes, landscape styles that reflected East Asian aesthetics. The historical chronicles written under Ilkhanate patronage, particularly Rashid al-Din's monumental compendium of chronicles, attempted to write a universal history that included not just Islamic and Persian history, but also the histories of China, India, and Europe. It was an unprecedented attempt to see the world as a single story, a connected narrative rather than separate, isolated tales. The book itself was produced by a workshop that included scholars from multiple cultures, illustrators who blended artistic traditions, and translators who worked between languages. It was flawed and incomplete, as any such ambitious project would be, but it represented a vision of history that would not appear again until much later. In China, under the Yuan dynasty established by Kublai Khan, the cultural exchange worked differently but was no less significant. Kublai invited Persian astronomers to Beijing to help reform the Chinese calendar. He employed Central Asian musicians who introduced new instruments and musical modes to the Chinese court. He patronized Chinese artists and poets, but also ensured that Mongols maintained political dominance, creating a complex hierarchical system that privileged Mongols and their Central Asian allies while placing the conquered Chinese lore in the official order. It was not a system designed for harmony. It was designed for control, but it had the unintended effect of bringing together people and ideas that would never have met otherwise. Chinese drama flourished during the Yuan period, partly because traditional Confucian scholars, excluded from government positions, turned to the arts. The result was a golden age of theater that drew on multiple cultural influences and produced works that are still performed today. The movement of craftsmen was particularly important. When the Mongols conquered a city, they routinely separated out skilled workers, weavers, metalworkers, ceramicists, engineers, and transported them elsewhere in the empire where their skills were needed. This was brutal for the individuals involved, torn from their homes and sent to foreign lands, but it had the effect of spreading techniques and technologies rapidly. Chinese potters ended up in Persia, teaching their methods and learning Persian decorative styles, creating hybrid ceramics that were neither purely Chinese nor purely Persian, but something new. Persian and Central Asian weavers brought their carpet-making techniques to China, where they were adapted and refined. Glassmakers from Syria found themselves working in Mongolia, creating objects that blended Islamic and nomadic aesthetics. These forced migrations were tragedies on a personal level, but they accelerated the pace of cultural and technological exchange in ways that voluntary trade alone could never have achieved. Food, too, traveled along these routes, changing cuisines in ways that are still visible today. Noodles, which may have originated in China, spread westward and evolved into the pasta of Italy, though the exact route and timing are still debated. Rice cultivation techniques moved along the Silk Road, allowing regions that had relied on wheat or millet to diversify their crops. Spices from the East, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, became valued luxuries in Europe, worth their weight in gold. Sugar, which had been refined in India and the Middle East, spread eastward into China and westward into Europe, beginning its transformation from rare medicine to common commodity. The Mongols themselves, coming from a culture that lived primarily on meat and dairy, were exposed to the agricultural abundance of their settled subjects and adapted, though they never lost their preference for arag, fermented maize milk, which they tried unsuccessfully to convince their Chinese subjects to appreciate. But there was a darker side to this connectedness, one that would not become fully apparent until the 14th century. The same roots that carried silk and spices and ideas also carried disease. The bubonic plague, which had existed in isolated pockets for centuries, found in the Mongol trade routes a perfect vector for expansion. Fleas on rats traveling in grain shipments, moving from caravan to caravan, from city to city, following the paths that the Mongols had made safe and efficient. The disease spread from Central Asia westward into Europe and eastward into China, killing indiscriminately, wiping out perhaps a third of the population in affected regions. The Black Death was one of the greatest catastrophes in human history, and while the Mongols did not cause it, their empire created the conditions that allowed it to spread so far and so fast. It is a reminder that connection is not inherently good or bad, it is simply powerful. It amplifies, it accelerates, it makes possible both great goods and great evils. The Mongol Empire, in connecting the world, demonstrated both sides of that equation. By the late 13th century, the great age of Mongol unity was beginning to fracture. The empire was too large, too diverse, stretched across too many time zones and cultures to function as a single entity forever. It was splitting into khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Yuan dynasty in China, each increasingly independent, each adapting to local conditions, each gradually losing the common identity that Genghis Khan had forged. But the Silk Road endured, at least for a while. The routes remained open, the trade continued, the flow of people and goods and ideas kept moving. It would not last. By the mid-14th century, the plague and political instability would choke the roots, and by the 15th century, the rise of oceanic trade would make them obsolete. But for a century, maybe a bit more, the world had been connected in a way it had never been before and would not be again until the age of steam and telegraph. The Mongols had done that, not through wisdom or kindness, but through conquest and control and a pragmatic willingness to let people move and trade as long as they paid their taxes and acknowledged the Khan. It was an accidental cosmopolitanism, an unintended globalization, a bridge built not for its own sake, but as a byproduct of empire. But it was real, and it mattered, and the world that emerged from it was different, changed in ways that no amount of time could completely erase. Chapter 5: The Fall and the Legacy. All empires fall. It is the only law of history that has never been broken, the only prediction that can be made with absolute certainty. They rise through brilliance or brutality or sheer accident. They expand until they seem inevitable and eternal. And then, slowly or suddenly, they crack and crumble and fade into the pages of books that future generations will or will not bother to read. The Mongol Empire was no exception. For all its size, for all its military genius, for all the terror and respect it commanded, it carried within itself the seeds of its own dissolution from the very beginning. Empires built on conquest must keep conquering, or they begin to devour themselves. Systems held together by the force of one man's will fracture when that man is gone. And cultures that span continents and encompass radically different ways of life cannot remain unified forever, no matter how efficient the postal system or how brutal the enforcement. The fall of the Mongol Empire was not a single event, but a long, slow dissolution, a gradual fading rather than a dramatic collapse. But fall it did. And yet, in falling, it left behind something that did not fade a legacy, vast and complicated, that shaped the world in ways both visible and invisible, ways that echo still in the 21st century. The trouble began, as it so often does, with succession. Genghis Khan died in 1227 during a campaign against the Western Shah, his body carried back to Mongolia and buried in an unmarked grave that has never been found as he wished. He had named his third son, Jede, as his successor, passing over his eldest, Joki, whose paternity was forever clouded by the shadow of Bert's captivity, and his second son, Jegetai, who was too rigid and uncompromising to rule such a diverse empire. Jede was capable, pragmatic, a man who could balance competing interests and continue his father's work. And for a time, the empire held together. Jedi completed the conquest of northern China, expanded westward into Russia and Eastern Europe, built the capital at Karakorum, and maintained the administrative systems that kept goods and information flowing across the vast territories. But he also drank heavily, made impulsive decisions, and died in 1241, possibly from alcohol-related illness, leaving the empire without clear leadership just as it was poised to invade Western Europe. The succession crisis that followed was the first crack in the foundation. Jede's widow, Trejin, ruled as regent while various factions maneuvered for power. Eventually, Jede's son, Jiek, was chosen as Great Khan, but he was weak and died after only 2 years. The succession passed to a different branch of the family, Manji, grandson of Genghis, through his youngest son, Talui. Manji was competent, perhaps the last truly effective Great Khan, but his reign marked a shift. The empire was no longer unified by shared conquest and the living memory of Genghis. It was beginning to fragment along geographical and cultural lines. Manjik's brothers ruled distant regions, Kublai in China, Hulagu in Persia, Arik-Baki in the Mongolian heartland, and each had their own power bases, their own interests, their own visions of what the empire should be. When Manji died in 1259, during a campaign in southern China, the fragile unity shattered completely. The civil war that followed was brief but decisive. Kublai and Arik-Beki both claimed the title of Great Khan, and the empire divided between them. Kublai controlled China and had the wealth and resources of the most prosperous region. Arik-Beki held the traditional heartland of Mongolia and the loyalty of the more conservative nomadic factions. They fought for 4 years, and Kublai won, not through superior cavalry tactics, but through control of supplies and resources. Arik-Beki, unable to feed his armies, surrendered in 1264. Kublai showed mercy, sparing his brother's life, but the damage was done. The other Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia recognized Kublai's title as Great Khan only nominally. In practice, they were independent rulers, pursuing their own policies, making their own alliances, and increasingly hostile to one another. The Mongol Empire, as a unified entity, was finished. What remained were successor states, fragments that would continue for decades or even centuries, but would never again act as a single force. Kublai Khan, ruling from his capital at Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing, focused his efforts on China. He completed the conquest of the Song dynasty in the south, finally unifying China under Mongol rule for the first time, and established the Yuan dynasty. He adopted Chinese administrative practices, patronized Chinese culture, and attempted to present himself as a legitimate Chinese emperor in the Confucian tradition, while also maintaining Mongol identity and privileges. It was a delicate balance, and it never entirely worked. The Chinese elite resented being ruled by foreigners. The Mongols resented being absorbed into Chinese culture. Kublai himself grew distant from the steppe traditions that had defined his grandfather's empire, becoming more of a Chinese emperor than a Mongol Khan. He launched expensive and ultimately failed invasions of Japan and Southeast Asia, draining the treasury and exhausting his armies. When he died in 1294, he left behind an empire that was prosperous but precarious, unified in name but divided in reality. His successors in China were increasingly weak. Court intrigues multiplied. Factions competed for power. The later Yuan emperors were often children or incompetents, manipulated by advisors and regents. Corruption spread through the administration. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, famines were blamed on the loss of the mandate of heaven. That ancient Chinese concept that justified or condemned rulers based on their virtue and effectiveness. Rebellions broke out, first small and local, then larger and more coordinated. The most significant was led by a peasant-turned-monk-turned-rebel named Zhu Yuanzhang, who would eventually found the Ming dynasty. By the 1360s, the Yuan dynasty was collapsing, its armies defeated, its territories shrinking, its legitimacy evaporated. In 1368, the last Yuan emperor fled north to Mongolia, and Chinese rule returned to Chinese hands. The Mongols had ruled China for less than a century, and they would never rule it again. In Persia, the Ilkhanate followed a different trajectory but arrived at a similar end. Hulagu Khan, who had conquered Persia and sacked Baghdad in 1258, established a realm that stretched from Afghanistan to eastern Turkey, encompassing some of the richest and most culturally sophisticated territories in the Islamic world. Unlike Kublai, Hulagu and his successors did not try to remain apart from the local culture. They were fascinated by Persian civilization, by its art and literature, by its administrative sophistication. Hulag's grandson, Ghazan Khan, converted to Islam in 1295, and with him, the ruling Mongol elite of Persia became Muslim. It was a momentous shift. The descendants of the conquerors who had destroyed Baghdad and slaughtered the Abbasid Caliph were now defenders of the faith, patrons of mosques and madrasas integrated into the very civilization they had once threatened to erase. This conversion brought stability for a time, but it also accelerated the process of assimilation. The Mongol rulers of Persia became Persian in all but name. They spoke Persian, dressed in Persian styles, married into Persian noble families, and governed according to Persian traditions. The distinctiveness that had made them Mongol faded with each generation. And as it faded, so did the unity and strength of the Ilkhanate. Internal disputes, economic troubles, and the constant warfare with the Golden Horde to the north drained resources and weakened central authority. When the last effective Ilkhan died in 1335, the realm fragmented into a patchwork of successor states ruled by local dynasties. The Mongol period in Persia was over, absorbed into the long continuum of Persian history, leaving behind architectural monuments, artistic influences, and historical chronicles, but no lasting Mongol state. The Golden Horde, ruling the steppes of Russia and the lands around the Black Sea, lasted longer but followed a similar pattern. The Mongols there maintained their nomadic lifestyle more stubbornly than their cousins in China or Persia, but they too could not resist the pull of the cultures they ruled. They converted to Islam in the early 14th century. They adopted Turkic language and customs, gradually becoming more Turkic than Mongol. They maintained their control over the Russian principalities through a system of tribute and vassalage, allowing local rulers to govern as long as they paid their taxes and acknowledged Mongol supremacy. But as the 14th and 15th centuries progressed, the Golden Horde weakened. It split into competing khanates, Kazan, Crimea, Astrakhan, each smaller and more vulnerable than the unified whole had been. Meanwhile, the Russian principalities, particularly Moscow, grew stronger, playing the Mongol successors against each other, gradually asserting independence. By the late 15th century, Russia was free of Mongol rule, and the fragments of the Golden Horde were either absorbed into the expanding Russian state or reduced to minor regional powers that would eventually be conquered or vassalized. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the heartland of the old Silk Road, endured the longest in a recognizably Mongol form, but it too fragmented and evolved. It split into western and eastern sections, each pursuing different policies, each gradually losing the centralized control that had defined Mongol rule. In the late 14th century, a new conqueror arose from this region, Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane. He was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, though he claimed connection through marriage, but he consciously modeled himself on the great conqueror, seeking to recreate the Mongol Empire in his own image. He succeeded in building a vast realm through similar methods, brilliant military strategy combined with calculated terror, but his empire, like the Mongol Empire before it, did not survive his death. It fragmented, and the pieces eventually became the various Turkic and Persian states of Central Asia, regions that would be absorbed by Russia or Persia or remain independent until the modern era. The Mongol identity, as a unifying force, as a source of political legitimacy, gradually faded into history. Yet even as the political structures crumbled, even as the Khanates dissolved and the Mongol rulers were absorbed or expelled, the legacy remained. It remained in the bloodlines. Genetic studies have shown that a significant percentage of the population of Central Asia and a notable percentage in regions as far apart as Russia and China carry genetic markers suggesting descent from Genghis Khan's lineage. The Mongol practice of taking multiple wives and concubines, combined with the privileged position of the ruling class, meant that the conquerors literally reshaped the genetic map of Eurasia. Millions of people alive today are, in some distant way, descendants of the man who was born as Temujin on the frozen steppe. It is a strange and somewhat unsettling legacy, a reminder that conquest leaves marks not just on maps, but on the very fabric of human populations. The legacy remained in the maps themselves. The Mongol conquests redrew political boundaries in ways that lasted for centuries. The unification of China under the Yuan dynasty, however brief, set a precedent for centralized rule that subsequent dynasties followed. The Mongol destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258 ended the symbolic unity of the Islamic world, fragmenting it into regional powers that would never again be united under a single religious political authority. The Mongol rule over Russia, the so-called Mongol yoke, delayed Russian development in some ways, but also pushed Moscow toward centralization and expansion, creating the foundations for the Russian Empire that would eventually dominate Eurasia. The Khanates that emerged from the Mongol Empire's collapse became the basis for many modern nations: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, parts of Iran, parts of Russia states whose borders and identities were shaped by the Mongol period. The legacy remained in technology and knowledge. The spread of gunpowder technology, facilitated by Mongol conquests and trade networks, changed warfare forever. By the 15th century, cannon were breaking down castle walls in Europe, and firearms were beginning to replace the bow and the sword as primary weapons. The compass and improved maritime navigation techniques, which had traveled from China along the Silk Road, enabled European explorers to venture across oceans, leading eventually to the age of exploration and Columbian exchange. Printing technology, which spread westward from China during the Mongol period, laid the groundwork for the information revolution of the Renaissance and the Reformation. Paper money, which the Mongols experimented with extensively in China, became a model for later monetary systems. Medical and astronomical knowledge that crossed borders during the Pax Mongolica enriched both Islamic and European science. The Mongols created none of these innovations themselves, but by connecting the world, they accelerated their spread and ensured that knowledge developed in one region could benefit all regions. The legacy remained in the imagination, in the stories people told and the fears they harbored. For centuries after the Mongol Empire's collapse, the name of Genghis Khan remained synonymous with destruction, with the end of worlds. In Russia, the Mongol period was remembered as a time of darkness, of subjugation, of cultural stagnation, though modern historians debate how accurate this characterization truly is. In the Islamic world, the sack of Baghdad was remembered as one of the greatest catastrophes in history, the moment when the Golden Age ended and the long decline began. In China, the Yuan dynasty was often portrayed as a foreign interruption, a period of alien rule that had to be overcome before China could return to its natural state of self-governance under native dynasties. These memories were not entirely wrong. The Mongol conquests were destructive. The death tolls were staggering, the cultural losses irreplaceable, but they were incomplete. They focused on the violence and ignored the connections, on what was lost rather than what was created, on the breaking rather than the building. In Mongolia itself, the memory evolved differently. After the empire's fall, the Mongols returned to their steppe origins, fragmented into tribes again, caught between the expanding powers of China and Russia, no longer the conquerors, but the conquered. For centuries, they lived in relative obscurity, remembered by the outside world primarily as historical villains, as the barbarians who had once threatened civilization itself. But within Mongolia, the memory of Genghis Khan remained alive, passed down through oral traditions, through epic poems and songs, through a cultural pride that no amount of political decline could entirely erase. He was remembered not as a destroyer, but as a unifier, as the man who had taken scattered tribes and made them a nation, who had given them glory and purpose, who had made the world acknowledge their existence. In the 20th century, when Mongolia finally achieved independence from Chinese and Russian influence, Genghis Khan was rehabilitated as a national hero, his image appearing on currency and monuments, his story taught in schools as a source of identity and pride. It is a reminder that history is not fixed, that how we remember the past changes depending on who is doing the remembering and what they need the past to mean. The Mongol legacy also lived on in the political structures and ideas that emerged from their empire. The concept of a vast multi-ethnic empire governed by a single law, where administrative positions were based on merit rather than solely on birth, where trade and communication were protected and encouraged across enormous distances. These were not Mongol inventions, but the Mongols implemented them on a scale never seen before. Later empires studied the Mongol model, consciously or unconsciously borrowing elements of it. The Ottoman Empire, which rose in the centuries after the Mongol collapse, employed similar administrative techniques, similar systems of merit-based advancement, similar methods of integrating diverse populations. The Mughal Empire in India, founded by Babur, a descendant of both Genghis Khan and Timur, explicitly drew on Mongol traditions while adapting them to South Asian conditions. Even the Russian Empire, which defined itself partly in opposition to its Mongol conquerors, absorbed aspects of Mongol administrative practice, particularly in its methods of controlling vast territories and diverse populations. The Mongols demonstrated that empires could function at continental scale, and that demonstration influenced every empire builder who came after. In Europe, the Mongol invasions of the 13th century left scars but also questions. The Mongols had reached the borders of Western Europe, had defeated armies in Poland and Hungary, had demonstrated that the Christian kingdoms were not invincible, that their castles and their knights and their faith could not protect them from a sufficiently determined and capable enemy. Then the Mongols had withdrawn, called back by the death of Genghis Khan, and Europe had been spared. But the memory remained. European chroniclers wrote about the Mongols with a mixture of horror and fascination, describing them as scourges sent by God to punish Christian sins, or as instruments of divine plan whose purpose was mysterious. The experience forced Europe to confront its vulnerability, to recognize that it was not the center of the world, that there were powers in the East capable of destroying it. This realization, uncomfortable as it was, contributed to a shift in European thinking, a movement away from insularity toward engagement with the wider world, a curiosity about what lay beyond Christendom that would eventually fuel the age of exploration. The Black Death, that catastrophic pandemic that killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in the mid-14th century, was another part of the Mongol legacy, though an unintended one. The disease traveled along the trade routes that the Mongols had secured and systematized, moving from Central Asia westward into Europe with terrifying speed. It was carried by merchant ships, by caravans, by travelers who had no idea they were transporting death. The plague devastated Europe, but it also transformed it. Labor became scarce, and peasants gained bargaining power they had never had before. The feudal system began to crack. The church's authority was questioned when prayers proved useless against the disease. The demographic collapse created economic and social upheaval that contributed to the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance. The Mongols did not cause the plague. It existed long before their empire, but they created the conditions that allowed it to spread, the networks that connected distant regions, the traffic that carried goods and people and germs across continents. It is a sobering reminder that connectivity has costs, that the same routes that carry silk and spices also carry suffering. Yet for all the destruction, for all the millions who died, for all the cities that were erased and the civilizations that were disrupted, it is impossible to deny that the Mongol Empire changed the world in fundamental ways. It demonstrated that the barriers between East and West, between steppe and city, between nomad and settler were permeable, that they could be crossed and even erased given sufficient force and organization. It showed that empires could span continents, that diverse peoples could be governed under a single system, that trade and communication could function at global scale. It spread technologies and ideas that would have remained isolated for decades or centuries longer without the Mongol facilitation. It created a historical consciousness of connection, a memory that the world had once been more integrated, that would inspire future attempts at globalization. The Mongols built roads, literally and metaphorically, and those roads were never entirely forgotten, even after the empire that built them had crumbled into dust. As the night deepens and the story draws toward its close, we return to where we began, to the cold wind of the Mongolian steppe, to the boy born with blood in his fist, to the question of what it all meant. Genghis Khan died in 1227, more than 750 years ago. His empire fragmented and dissolved within a century of his death. The Mongols, as a conquering force, faded from history, remembered more for their brutality than their achievements, more feared than understood. And yet his shadow stretches across the centuries, touching us still in ways both visible and invisible, in the genetic code of millions, in the borders of nations, in the technologies we use daily, in the very idea that the world can be connected, that distance is not destiny, that barriers can be overcome. He was a man of his time, shaped by the harsh realities of steppe life, by the endless cycle of survival and conquest that defined nomadic existence. But he was also more than that. He was a vision of possibility, of what could be achieved through will and organization, and the refusal to accept the limits that everyone else considered inevitable. He changed the world for better and for worse, and the world has never entirely changed back. The steppe remains cold and vast and indifferent. The wind still blows across the grasslands where Temujin was born, where he struggled and suffered and eventually triumphed. Somewhere beneath that grass, in an unmarked grave that has never been found and likely never will be, lies the body of the man who became Genghis Khan. The empire is gone. The armies are dust. The cities they destroyed have been rebuilt or forgotten. But the story endures, passed down through generations, told and retold in 1,000 different ways, in 1,000 different languages, a story of conquest and connection, of destruction and creation, of how one man in the empire he built reached across continents and centuries to touch us still. And now, as the story ends and sleep beckons, perhaps we can close our eyes and imagine that distant past, not as a nightmare of violence, but as a reminder of human possibility, of what can be achieved when will and vision align, when the impossible becomes merely difficult, and the difficult becomes history. Rest now. The Mongols rode long ago, but their echo remains, and in that echo, there are lessons still to learn, still to understand, still to carry with us into whatever future we are building, one night, one story, one breath at a time. This bedtime history journey has carried us from the frozen steppe to the edges of Europe, from a boy clutching blood to an empire that reshaped the world. May it guide you gently into restful sleep, and may the echoes of history become the quiet companions of your dreams. Sleep well.